Hello, Charlotte. Oh, you're here. Well, I guess I don't have to talk to myself for a minute. How is everyone? I hope everyone had a good holiday weekend for those in the United States. Everyone had a good weekend in general. Did everybody watch my video on the Otaku Killer? I thought that came out pretty good, except I messed up a few things. But it took too long to upload, so I didn't feel like fixing it. People will figure it out. I said 2,500 days instead of hours. Man days. That's what I don't know. It was what the article said, but it didn't make any sense after I read it back. So I hope everyone's well. This should be the last day of the book. Thank you, India. Last day of the book. We're done after this. Thank God. The book was good. Yes, you did. The book was good until we got to the middle, and then the words got too wordy. Hi, James. And then Valley Girl Talana. The words got too big. Hi, Susan. You're welcome. I'm so glad I finished this book. It was so interesting in the beginning, and now it's not. But I'm not going to stop reading a book if people are listening. So let's get this on and finish this. Okay. I must confess that I found myself liking these sweet old men. When I feel ashamed of this, I tell myself anybody would have liked them if they sat with them, touched them, heard the sound of their voices, listened to their stories. Spending 2 long afternoons with Kaneko-san, for instance, I had the cliche reaction that people have in those situations. I was surprised he was normal, so harmless. Waiting in front of his house for him the second day, I couldn't help grinning happily when I saw him arrive, scooting towards us on an old upright bicycle, gray hair messy in the breeze, legs pumping slow, intentional circles, wobbling at the end, for all the world reminding me of Kermit the Frog videos from my childhood. When we began our interview, his wife remained nearby, close enough to watch over him. He had recently returned from the hospital, but generally staying out of our sight. He was nearly 90, but he had an energy about him that felt young, almost boyish, like he couldn't stop from marveling at each moment he was alive. Oh, hi, Missy. Yeah, isn't it? Like he couldn't believe he had survived. He recalled an intense moment when he expected to die while in a prison camp in China. All the soldiers were called to the courthouse. They all suspected it was going to be a mass execution. Kaneko-san states, this time at last, I thought. And then they called out all the names. The judge, right? Called them out. And then in the end, it was announced immediate release. And for a moment, everyone was silent. Everybody was half unbelieving. And in the midst of that, little by little, everybody started bursting out in tears. Wailed and cried, we did. We men in our 30s, men in their 50s, all of them yelled out, wailing, hugging each other, and cried. And then, just like that, without going back into the prison camp at all, then we went into a famous restaurant. We entered the restaurant and there was a farewell party, and we thought, we are getting all sorts of good things here. And then the translator, when he came, he went around to each table, and then I asked, why did China let us free? And then this is what he said. You see, if we were to execute you, your father, your mother, they would cry, wouldn't they? The citizens of Japan would be angry, wouldn't they? China does not want war with Japan. We definitely don't want that. That's why we set you free. Kaneko-san, like the others I met, is so thankful to China. At first, he thought they were being released as part of some negotiation for reparations. But when he realized they were simply being released, he couldn't believe it. He said it began a transformation in his soul, bringing him to support communist China and to perceive the person he was before as a kind of devil. Prison camp in Siberia, where he had been for the 5 previous years, had been very different. It was brutal and humiliating time. He remembers it being too cold to go outside, so urinating in the canteen he had to drink from. He recalls slipping in the ice in the latrine and falling onto the sewage pits, getting covered in icy shavings of feces, and then running inside for warmth, only to have the shavings melt and begin stinking up the room. There was no medicine, he said. His friends died of pneumonia and diarrhea. He recalled being forced to clean the storeroom where they piled dead bodies in the winter because the ground was too frozen and too hard for digging. They piled up like frozen fish. The suffering of those 5 years, he said, was far worse than any during the war. What was perhaps just as difficult, when Kaneko-san returned to Japan after release from China, he was publicly shamed. Not for the war crimes he committed, but for confessing to them. It was a painful playback for the years he had lost. Angry, Kaneko-san says, when we, who out of patriotism went to China and fought, return home, now, somehow or another, we've been brainwashed and are under inspection. Have you heard of such nonsense? That's right. When we go somewhere, you count on the police to come along behind. Everything. What a month, what day, what time. It's all written down. That's how it was taken. Have you ever heard such nonsense? However you think about it, For His Majesty the Emperor, we gave our lives. Japan lost. When we were shipped off, put to manual labor. When we come back, brainwashed. This nonsense. No company would hire us. I did go to a company, and guess what? It ended in 2 days. Fired in just 2 days. Those willing to talk about what really happened, especially those who publicly voiced support of Communist China, were hated, ostracized, and threatened. Sakakura-san remembered being at a meeting for veterans where one of the speakers spent a significant amount of time denying that war crimes had been committed. Now he's saying there isn't anyone who ever did these things. And I thought then that I would object, but then since I was all alone, I just stayed quiet and just joined in. Later, Sakakura-san went on a trip with his soldiers' buddies. He brought it up and them in the smaller group, thinking either they would privately agree with him about what they had done, or he would teach them a lesson and shame them for denying it. And about these bad things, I said, but you did all these things, didn't you? I said. And he, referring to one of the other soldiers, he grabbed onto my sleeve and said, listen to me. You say those things and you are done for. Nobody wanted these things to be said. Men like Kaneko-san and Sakakura-san were violating the collective decision to be silent and to deny. And for that, too, they could not find forgiveness. Once again, they are common starting assumptions for thinking about storytelling and human rights. For listeners and bystanders, stories promote bonding and empathy promotes helping behaviors. For survivors, stories provide intelligibility and closure provides healing. I want to focus for now on the former. As Richard Rorty frames it, we have experienced 2 centuries of moral progress largely because sad and sentimental stories, repeated and varied over the centuries, have induced us, the rich, safe, powerful people, to tolerate and even to cherish powerless peoples whose appearance or habits or beliefs at first seemed an insult to our own moral identity, our sense of the limits of permissible human variation. With each new story we hear, a previously hidden or invisible form of suffering is exposed. E.M. Forster's A Passage to India forever altered British views on colonialism. Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin mainstreamed what had formerly been the outlier movement of abolition. New stories like these teach us new sights of care, new sights of pain, and we instinctively respond to them. When we read Richardson's Pamela, as Lynn Hunt would put it, we learn pity for all Pamelas, fictional and corporal, or rather we respond with pity as a biological mandate. As Virginia Woolf characterizes it in 3 Guineas, we see photographs of the war dead and we feel a natural disgust that makes us oppose war. Those photographs are not an argument. They are simply a crude statement of fact addressed to the eye. But the eye is connected with the brain with the nervous system. When we look at those photographs, some fusion takes place within us. However different, the education, the traditions behind us, our sensations are the same, and they are violent. Such moral theories of natural benevolence date back to the 18th century when, according to Julie Stone Peters, figures like Francis Hutchinson and the early of Shaftesbury participated in the reformulation of Aristotelian catharsis as an emotion-based social union through narrative identification. Hi, Carl. Pity, generated by narrative, Peter writes, was to serve as a mechanism for uniting humanity and stimulating charitable action through the sentimental bond. And this mechanism was perceived to be part of our very physiology, Thomas Jefferson writes. Nature hath implanted in our breasts a love of others, a sense of duty to them, a moral instinct, in short, which prompts us irresistibly to feel and to successor their distresses. Theorizing a sense of soul we call the sympathetic, Francis Hutchinson writes, when we see our know the pain, distress, or misery of any kind which another suffers, and turn our thoughts to it, we feel a strong sense of pity and a great proneness to relieve, where no contrary passion withholds us. But we need to go that far. Sympathy doesn't need to be natural, neurally programmed, or a God-given to have force. We don't have to imagine that humans inherently tend towards the good. After all, satire and suspicion of moral theories of natural benevolence are also conspicuous in the 18th century, which is much the age of de Sade as in the age of humanitarianism. The French novel Madame Ricobone declared in 1769, one would readily create unfortunates in order to taste the sweetness of feeling sorry for them. And the protagonist of François René's Voyager Sentimental 1786 says, a tear of sentiment, what sweeter reward. Empathy and the altruism effect can have varied subterranean emotional resources. They can be contingent social constructs, artifacts of a particular society's way of socializing its subjects into collaborative pro-social behavior, and they can nonetheless still feel as implicable as biology in shaping the lives of those subjects. Stories train us how to act and how to feel. They help us create alternative imaginary selves, more beautiful, more courageous, more empathetic, more tender, that we yearn to be more like. In that way, human rights cultures may operate according to the same deep and powerful principles of social behavior that drive brand loyalty or attachment to logos. Principles either to disdain than to transcend. Yes, this is the kind of person I would like to be. This is how I'd like to see me. This is how I'd like people to see me. We don't have to be good and want to be good. We are, after all, comprehensively self-centered creatures. Even our moments of deepest anguish over the fates of others can be emotional extensions of our unceasing self-regard. It is brutal, but basic physiological truth. For instance, that grief over the loss of loved ones involved no small portion of sorrow over our own hurtling mortality. Or, in like manner, that empathy for distant strangers requires first the cognitive work of transforming the strangers into people that appear related to or like us. One would have to be an impossible more purist to lament such human self-care. We don't have to care only for others to care for others. Caring for others can be complicated, multi-layered, an expression, among other things, of our self-care or even a strategy we adopt for enhancing our self-concept, and it still counts as caring for others. While they trouble me, I'm never fully convinced by arguments that claim that partially self-interested motivations negate the goodness of actions or irredeemably taint the goodness of the interior moral deliberations that produce them. At the same time, however, the social fact of impure motivations has always made it easy to become cynical about the popularization of sentiment, and never more so than now, living as we do in a society of spectacle. Ishmael Bey's memoir of child soldiering, discussed earlier, was reviewed this way in Time magazine. Bey is a rock star. The child soldier is the most sexy category of war victim, and the weaponized child is a great scene setter for Hollywood with a weapons-grade crush on Africa. The reaction this sort of thing provokes in us not just about purism. There's something morally significant about the instinctive revulsion we feel when we see such narcissistic altruism, such care that it is much about the desires of the helper as the needs of the helped. It is caring by the bulk, caring that is defined not only by curiosity, but by shallow curiosity, caring that can look at others without seeing the particularity of the other. Stanley Cavell weighs the consequences. The humanitarian's intentions is to acknowledge the outcast as a human being, but his effect is to treat the human being as an outcast, as if the condition of the outcastness defined a social role, a kind of sub-profession suited for a certain kind of human being. The narcissism behind this reduction of others often manifests itself in one of two ways: depth, larceny, or moral vanity. Consider each. That is true. We don't do something good unless there's something. If we do something good, even like a nice gesture, we wouldn't do it if we didn't feel some type of happiness inside us or some type of like, I'm a good person. If we didn't get that feeling, nobody would do anything for anybody. So technically being a good person is a selfish motivation. First, depth larceny. Eva Hoffman argues that some portion of the ostensibly empathetic and respectful social elevation of Holocaust survivors involve the petty desire of the comfortable for existential grandeur. Survivors are sent to suburban high schools, interviewed, begged for their tales from hell. Oh, I never thought about that. We beg people to tell us their tales of hell. This desire for the survivor is, in part, lurid interest. We love those Holocaust stories, one Hoffman student tells her. They're so dramatic. But it is also, writes Hoffman, a matter of significance envy. We live lives of passivity, leisure, and spectacle, our art, our culture, our politics, even our psyches, writes Hoffman, can be deconstructed nearly out of existence. But the Holocaust cannot. It remains itself a promise of authenticity. The encounter with the survivor therefore puts the listener, whose life may feel banal, mediated, low stakes, close to the touch of history, close to the choices that matter, close finally to the real thing. My friend was in Buchenwald. A guest was overheard to say to another at a recent party, "Oh," restored the other rather smugly, "our friends was in Auschwitz." How easily our empathy for the victim, Hoffman concludes, turns into exploitation of the violation of the one thing that ought never be thus used, the pain and death of others. Hi, Lou. As bad as such under-identification is, however, the extremes are a little better. Over-identification, in which one has a desire, even need to deeply and sincerely emphasize, can lead to illusions of assimilating the other's experience, vicarious victimhood, or in the feelings that one's own survival as a witness is a kind of adequacy. An anti-identification, in which one endows the survivor with sanctity and approaches him with awe, functions as self-protective. Dory Lobb warns, a way to keep him at a distance, to avoid the intimacy entailed in knowing. But it isn't just that those various types of personal memorialization are morally distressing or narcissistic or callous at an individual level. It's that collectively they generate a secondary amnesia in which the Holocaust expands into an increasingly empty referent, a symbol of historical horror, an allegory of the real, the familiar catastrophe, and stand-in for authenticity and for history. See, I like when he talks about and deconstructs like how we interpret and treat atrocities. That interests me. I could read an entire book on that. Now consider moral vanity. At a dramatic rally in Edinburgh during the Make Poverty History campaign, an attempt to mobilize U.S. support for action against global poverty, Nairobi journalist John Camus asked a Scottish university student if he thought the spectacle would make any difference. "Should I be hopeful?" Camus asked. The student replied, "This is not only about you, it is about our humanity." In other words, the point of the campaign was much about publicly becoming a certain kind of person as it was actually bringing relief to those who were suffering. One teacher commented, "I feel proud for the first time," and another student declared, "This is very exciting. I want to be counted among those who stood up against world poverty." Kate Nash comments on such reactions. The creation of feeling for the suffering of distant people, which can generate a collective understanding of moral obligations to act to relieve that suffering, always risks degenerating into emotionally indulgent admiration of one's own sensitivity, sincerity, and strength of will. Wow, that is a powerful statement. That's powerful. Like if there's a world disaster, you can be like, "Oh, I went to," or like Black Lives Matter. How many people just went to a Black Lives Matter protest during George Floyd so they could just be like, "I went to the George Floyd protest," so they can throw that around. "I went to a George Floyd protest. I went, but I truly believed in it." Like I would have like thrown myself in front of somebody so they wouldn't have gotten hurt. But most people just did it so they can be like, "I'm part of history. I have to do this. This is going to be historical." Have you ever heard that? You got to go. This is going to be history. It is one thing for a man to act out of his great love for Isidore, philosopher Bernard William writes, another for him to do so out of concern for his image or of himself as a great Tristan. But there is an important distinction to be made here between moral vanity and moral pride. It seems a deep confusion ethically and pointless as a psychological matter to lament moral pride, the feeling of satisfaction that comes from receiving approbation from others for virtuous behavior, the feeling of inner harmony we get when we act accordingly to our identity conferring moral commitments, and even the feelings of excitement and thrill that may come from immersing oneself in a righteous collective. Holocaust rescuer Hedy Volt recalls her youthful work as part of the Nazi resistance with an almost joyful nostalgia. Moral vanity, or what Williams calls moral self-indulgence, is a different matter. We are morally vain when our moral pride is no longer the consequence of actions, but for the goal of them. Moral vanity is temporally prior. It implies, William writes, that a person has substituted for thought about what is needed, a thought which focuses disproportionately upon the expression of his own disposition, and that he derives pleasure from the thought that his disposition will have been expressed rather than deriving pleasure. As an agent who is not self-indulgent may, from the thought of how things would be if he acts in a certain way, that way being, though he need not think this, the expression of his disposition. This kind of moral vanity, writes Williams, is a reversal at a line which I take to be fundamental to any morality and indeed sane life at all, between self-concern and other concern. Happy almost birthday, Carl. Hello, Renee. The central problem for Williams is the relative dominance of reflexivity in the moral deliberation. It is not the basic characteristics of a generous man's deliberations, Williams argues, that they use the premise, I am a generous man. And it is no defense to redescribe such self-regard, that is, taking the expression of one's own disposition as a motive for acting, as a matter of integrity. Integrity is not properly a motive. It is not a virtue, and it is not something we defend, pursue, or display. Rather, Williams argues, when a person is said to display integrity, it means that he is acting from those dispositions and motives which are most deeply his, and has also the virtues that enable him to do that. Integrity does not enable him to do it, nor is it what he acts from when he does so. A person with integrity generally cares for something and has the characteristics necessary to live the spirit of that. A person who seeks integrity, by contrast, cares primarily from himself. It is troubling to imagine the ostensibly generous man smiling to himself as he demonstrates his graciousness, to imagine Tristan secretly delighting in his self-image. But is their interior pleasure the only problem? Would it help to reimagine Williams's cases without such suspicious satisfaction? I don't think so. Let's imagine a more serious Kantian moral agent. Let's call him Smith. Smith does not smile to himself. Smith draws bright lines around the problem of pleasing self-regard. He believes actions are morally worthy only when they are performed for the motive of duty. For Smith, people who perform moral actions out of self-interest, shopkeepers who are honest because it's good for business, or satisfying sympathy, people who find inner pleasure in spreading the joy around them, are not performing actions of moral worth. Smith totally excludes self-regard. Only respect for the moral law suffices. Is Smith our ultimate answer to the queasy pleasure of benevolent behavior? Ah, Carl. You guys are all my friends. Oh my God, we're so close. Perhaps, but many would say the price you pay for this solution is too high. When we see Smith acting from the motive of duty in Kant's strict way, we witness finally moral action untainted by pleasure. But at the same time, we witness something just as alienating and repugnant as pleasure. Michael Stocker explains, suppose you are in the hospital, recovering from a long illness. You are very bored and restless and at loose ends when Smith comes in once again. You are now convinced more than ever that he is a fine fellow and a real friend, taking so much time to cheer you up, traveling all the way across town and so on. You are so effusive with your praise and thanks that he protests that he always tries to do what he thinks is his duty, what he thinks will be best. You at first think he is engaging in a polite form of self-deprecation, relieving the moral burden. But the more you two speak, the more clear it becomes that he was literally telling the truth, that it is not essentially because of you that he came to see you, not because you are friends, but because he thought it was his duty, perhaps as a fellow Christian or communist or whatever, or simply because he knows of no one more in need of cheering up and no one easier to cheer up. Surely none of us would like to be treated that way by a friend. If the problems from Williams was a self-reflexivity of moral deliberation, the problem for Stocker is the abstraction of an other in moral deliberation. What's wrong, in other words, isn't that Smith is taking pleasure in seeing himself as a moral person. It's that he is acting from the motive of moral duty, that he's doing the right thing instead of visiting you. That's true. That people do things because they can uphold their moral duty to Christianity instead of just doing it because they do it because they're a good person. Together, Williams and Stocker reveal what is at stake for our intuition that there is something unworthy in the behavior of Kate Nash's morally callow, rally-going students. They are inauthentic in their relationship with those they are helping. The world's poor are duties rather than persons, and inauthentic in their relationship to themselves. They seek rather than have integrity. Hi, Jerry. But is it, in the end, really so bad to want to admire oneself as an altruist, or to elicit in others the desire to admire themselves as altruists, or to help others not because of who they are in particular, but because one wishes to be helping somebody? Mightn't we argue in all these cases that what we are witnessing here is the version of James Waller's escalating commitments, but pushing now towards care rather than injury? First, get them to wear bracelets and go to concerts, then to give money, then to collect signatures for petitions, then to make ethical career choices, eventually to become the kind of person who would disobey illegal orders or take risks to rescue another. It would be tragedy if our discomfort with morality as by means became integrity fetishism, if it began interfering with our ability to endorse and amplify the psychological counter techniques to genocide. How important, in the end, is the difference between appeasing altruists and the altruists, especially when appearing and the context means something more like to come forth than it is etymologically later variant, to seem. So, to return to Hutchinson, Shaftesbury, and Jefferson, is it true that we are drawn to stories of suffering because of our natural benevolence? Over the centuries, many theories have offered to explain the seemingly paradoxical drive in humans to expose themselves to representations of violence, disease, or injury visited upon other humans. In his Poetics, Aristotle notes that we take pleasure in contemplating the most precisely made images of things which in themselves we see with pain, because learning provides enjoyment. David Hume argues that sentiments of beauty in art transform the passions of fear and pity into delightful movements of the soul. In Beyond the Pleasure Principle, Freud explains that human impulse to repetitively return to the moments of suffering by arguing that we acquire a feeling of control over traumatic events when we play them in a controlled frameworks. And literary critic Norman Holland uses psychoanalytic models of sexual desire, aggression, and fear to argue that readers derive through stories the gratification of managing repressed fantasies. I don't know about that. It could also be argued that we are drawn to stories that provoke revulsion because it gives us pleasure to think of ourselves as the type of people who experience revulsion when witnessing violence, or that we experience the complex pleasure of using the suffering of others as an emotional contrast object. The blissful relief that comes in after terrorizing the pain of others, we let go and return to ourselves. The pleasure, in other words, of exhalation, combined with the satisfaction that comes from knowing not only that others have suffered like this, but they have suffered more, achieving status quo euphoria through downward social comparison. Edmund Burke explains how pain can be a cause of delight through analogy. Just as a regular physical excitation through labor is necessary for the pleasurably healthy functioning of our bodies, mental excitation through terror can be a mechanism for the healthy operation of our mental capacities. Psychologist Marvin Zuckerman summarizes contemporary biosocial theories of sensation seeking that argues that pleasure is produced by an optimal level of cognitive stimulation, and that repressed behaviors or danger encountered within protective frames are particularly stimulating as novelty. Others argue for the intrinsically positive variance of arousal jag, that is, negative stimulation followed by relief. Evolutionary accounts of social behavior point to the survival advantages enjoyed by creatures drawn to gratifying and thrilling literary entertainment, works that elicit strong emotion help. Humans refine their skills for obtaining and disseminating information about emotions, and thus become better adapted to the mind-reading, mind-revealing, and mind-concealing requirements of their lives. I think so, Lou. If it makes you feel good, you want to keep doing it. So you do things that, because you say, oh, well, like, wait, yeah, you're right. If it makes you feel good, I guess it's selfish. If that's the only reason you help people is because it makes you feel good. Discussing the banality of being, Ralph Waldo Emerson writes, there are moods in which we court suffering in the hope that here, at least, we shall find reality, sharp peaks and edges of truth. Emerson is intellectually adjacent here to a broadly developed romantic view, exposed in the different ways by critics and philosophers ranging from Max Weber and Georges Bataille to Leslie Fielder, which asserts that in secularizing societies characterized by disenchantment, and in modernizing societies increasingly dominated by wage labor and consequently micro-regulation of body, behavior, and space, the encounter with evil and bodily violation substitutes for a lost spiritual clarity and transcendence. And the transgressions of crime and horror represent a form of liberation and an attractive Faustian heroism. God, If that wasn't the longest, most wordy sentence of my entire reading career, I don't know what is. By contrast, it could be argued that depictions of terror captivate precisely because they present an anxiety-inducing challenge to ethical and social order, only to ritualistically and satisfyingly banish it. Playing the historian trump card, Karen Haltunen answers this question of anomalous attraction by inverting it. Why wouldn't we enjoy representations of suffering? She argues that the idea of instinctive or natural revulsion from pain is distinctively modern invention, a product of the 18th century cult of sensibility. Sadistic pornography as popular cultural form is also, therefore, a modern invention, she argues. The consequence of making pain a taboo was a dramatic increase in pain's role in pornography. Makes sense. When you suppress or censor something, it bleeds out of a society in other ways. Humans are and always have been quite naturally fascinated by pain. Only in the modern world we are trained to believe that we are not attracted to things we are attracted to. If we defamiliarize the process and shift the perspective slightly, the leisure act of reading about the suffering of others looks like a deliberate exercise in schadenfreude rather than empathy. The reader picks up a novel knowing that the characters within will suffer pain, heartbreak, and exile. The reader savors it. And much the same could be said of the novelist. She creates characters with such complex imaginative layering that they feel real. She lives with them over time, invests them with deep personhood, often only to devise ingenious torments for them, often only to kill them. Even in the absence of gratuitous narrative affliction, writing needs heartlessness. The act of focus, for instance, creating secondary characters as ornaments to the principals who matters, is kind of ruthlessness. Some people matter, others do not. When we read fictions of suffering, we are, in part, feeding our need to see others suffer, whether in the mild form of downward social comparison or the extreme form of reckless delight in destruction. This speculation isn't unlike arguments long made of comedy. We laugh as an expression of our superiority. We laugh as a way of simultaneously experiencing and denying our exhilaration over a moment's liberated cruelty. Don't worry, there's nothing serious in this. We can enjoy it. If it isn't so hard for us to see that laughter can be pitiless, why not tears? Can't tears also serve as distancing or a defense mechanism that reinforces the privilege and isolation of the subject? But such cynicism, oh, I love that word. Everybody just say the word cynicism. Cynicism. It's an interesting word. It's hard to accept. There is a deep satisfaction, a sorrowful joy that comes from the experience of solidarity and suffering, from sharing one's grief and feeling the weight of another's. Sometimes I think it is a basic human need for connectedness, for something beyond the existentially impoverished quality of most human interactions. To have that feeling discredited, that is difficult. And this is precisely why sympathy and empathy have long been sites of intense interrogation in literary studies, because they are fundamental to the capacity of our living community and with dignity, fundamental to the changes we seek in the world and to the meaning such striving gives our lives. They are attractive targets for scholars who seek to be heard because their centrality to being means we are, each time freshly jolted by the deconstruction. On a certain level, however, whether or not the distrustful account of sympathetic reading I've just offered is plausible doesn't matter. Human motivation in a deep sense is not only unknowable, but also quite possibly unimportant. What matters is what these stories do. Do they make a difference? Do they promote helping behaviors? Most people working in human rights think they do, and so we tell the stories over and over. But perhaps they don't make a difference. Scarry warns of the dangers of relying upon generous imaginings for promoting social change. Uncle Tom's Cabin and Passage to India are rare and perhaps misleading examples of the power of cosmopolitan imagining. The human capacity to injure other people is very great, she writes, precisely because our capacity to imagine other people is very small. And anyway, perhaps empathy isn't so much like a muscle that can be trained as a capital that can be overspent. That is a very strong sentence. Think about that. Think about this sentence again. Where to go? Perhaps empathy isn't so much like a muscle that can be trained as a capital that can be overspent. We send our empathy on war photographs or on fictional people, caring anxiously for them and leaving nothing for those whose lives we can actually touch. Elsewhere, Sky warns, there is always a danger that the fictional character's suffering, whether physical or physiological, will divert our attention away from the living sister or uncle who can be helped by our compassion in a way that the fictional character cannot be. There's also the danger that because artists so successfully express suffering, they may themselves collectively come to the thought of as the most authentic class of sufferers, and they may inadvertently appropriate concern away from others in a radical need of assistance. I hate philosophy. I hate it. I hate philosophy. I almost quit college because of philosophy. I wonder how it must be being married to this author. He thinks too much. Perhaps after a good fictional cry, we are burned out emotionally and avoid empathy in the real world. Perhaps such weeping allows us to feel like we have already given enough of ourselves. Perhaps we have already sufficiently affirmed our self-concept, our sense of our own goodness through our fictional distress, and so feel no need to do more to achieve personal equilibrium. That what need for meaningful action when we have already done our job of caring? Rousseau expressed all these concerns in 1758. In giving our tears to these fictions, we have satisfied all of the humanity without having to give anything more of ourselves, whereas unfortunate people in person would require attention from us, relief, consolation, and work which would involve us in their pains and would require at least a sacrifice of our indolence, from all which we are quite content to be exempt. It could be said that our heart closes itself for fear of being touched at our expense, and the final counting, when a man has gone to admire fine actions and stories and to cry for imaginary miseries, what more can be asked of him? Is he not satisfied with himself? Does he not applaud his fine soul? Has he not acquitted himself of all that he owes to virtue by the homage which has just rendered it? What more could one want? That he practice it himself? He has no role to play. He is no actor. Sentimental politics, Laurent Berlant writes, substitutes changes in feeling for substantial social change. This argument has been made especially sharply in examinations of U.S. racism. Jody Melman, for instance, asserts that multicultural, sympathy-based literary studies in U.S. colleges and universities socializes white students to perceive themselves as anti-racist by virtue of their anti-racist feelings, even as they serve and benefit from the new apartheid between haves and have-nots. As Philip Fisher argues in his discussion of Uncle Tom's Cabin, the sentimental novel invokes tears rather than revolt. In the empathetic reading experience such work provides, he asserts, the feelings of suffering becomes more important than actions against suffering. And perhaps it is not even the feeling of suffering we are having when we become emotionally caught up in such stories. Perhaps it is not feeling in the deep, internal way we think of feeling. Perhaps it is something more on the surface, more exterior. And the claim of reason, Stanley Cavell distinguishes between the capacity for imagination and for imaginative. Oh my God, this word. I hate words that are long that look super simple to say because we already know the first part of the word, but imaginativeness merely produces vivid imagery. Dickens, he explains, excelled in both capacities, but he also knew that even though he could get the Pecksniffs and Myrtles of the world to cry over the pictures he presented of poverty and the deaths of children, he wouldn't make them see their personal connections to suffering. Slavoj Zizek presses the argument to an extreme, theorizing something like exteriorization of the self. Hi, Gordon. This is how we would grasp the fundamental Lacanian proposition that psychoanalysis is not a psychology. The most inanimate beliefs, even the most intimate emotions such as compassion, crying, sorrow, laughter, can be transferred, delegated to others without losing their sincerity. In his seminar of the excess of the ethic of psychoanalysis, Lacan speaks of the role of the chorus in the classical tragedy. We, the spectators, come to the theater worried, full of everyday problems, unable to adjust without reserve to the problems of the play. This is to feel the required fears and compassions, but no problem. There is the chorus, who feels the sorrow and compassion instead of us. Or more precisely, we feel the required emotion through the medium of the chorus. You are then relieved of all worries. Even if you do not feel anything, the chorus will do so in the place. Using canned laughter as a model for all externally experienced feelings, Zizek concludes that we can do our duty of compassion and accomplish our duty of mourning without ever needing to do more than gaze drowsily and stupidly at the television screen. After all, what do these awful stories actually make us do? Here's Rousseau again. I hear it said that tragedy leads to pity through fear. So it does. But what is this pity? A fleeting and vain emotion which lasts no longer than the illusion which produced it. A vestige of natural sentiment soon stifled by the passions. A sterile pity which feeds on a few tears and which has never produced the slightest act of humanity. Thus, the sanguinary Sulla cried at the accounts of evil he had not himself committed. Thus, the tyrant of Farah hid himself at the theater for fear of being seen groaning with Andromache and Priam, while he heard without emotions the cries of so many unfortunate victims slain daily by his orders. And even if pity generated by tragedy could truly affect us, could make us decide to take an action in the real world, the repertoire of actions available to us generally matter more than the pantomimes. Wolf writes, to scribble a name on a sheet of paper is easy. To attend a meeting where pacific opinions are more or less rhetorically reiterated to people who already believe in them is also easy. And to write a check in support of those vaguely acceptable opinions, though not so easy, is a cheap way of quieting what may conveniently be called one's conscience. Some would argue that Rousseau and Wolf are wrong here, or rather they're right about what they're measuring, but their measuring is the wrong kind of thing. As isolated acts frozen in time, none of the above, tears at the theater, petition rallies, checks, make much difference. But such acts are neither isolated nor temporarily frozen. Each is part of a collective of similar action that together make a difference. Each is also a point along an arc of time that might very well be tracking a path of moral evolution and escalating commitments. We are so almost done, people. We are so close. Rousseau and Wolf might reply, perhaps, but the problem isn't just that pity-inspired acts tend to be individually trifling. It's also that, as parts of collectives of similar action over arcs of time, they are potentially pernicious. They are the products of narratives, and the worries about pity and inspiring victimization narratives, especially sensational narratives, and especially sensational narratives about racial others, are many. Over time, they may solidify the notion of the victims as a separate category of persons. Victims can feel pressure to adapt their stories and even self-conceptions to fit global narrative expectations. Victimhood as identity undermines efforts by those in need to assert agency and even rights. Image saturation can make it difficult to see victims as person rather than patterns, and focus on extreme violence to the body distracts us from less theatrical forms of structural violence, harm through institutional denial of basic needs, thus thinning out efforts to imagine broader programs of social and economic justice. There are major challenges for the contemporary human rights movement. A philosophical system built upon our mutual capacity to suffer pain is separated only by a thin line from a philosophical system that understands survivors exclusively through their experience of pain. Commenting on an early draft of the previous section, a friend scribbled a note in the margins to me. You were in a dark place when you wrote this, Jim. It's such pessimism about sentimental human rights narration. Far-fetched, the product of mistaken ways of thinking. For scholars of human rights and witnessing who seek positive theoretical models for the work they are doing, models that are as intellectually persuasive and emotionally compelling as a depressing criticism just tracked, the world of Emmanuel Levinas have been something of an existential answer. Levinas' writing has ethics of alterity, is increasingly influential in literary and cultural studies today. At the heart of his philosophy is the metaphor of a face-to-face encounter with another person. The face of the other, Levinas writes, makes ethical claims upon us, claims that do not simply elicit responses from us, but instead constitute us. We come into being as particular persons in relation to others who, in the immediate face-to-face relationship, strike us both as infinitely foreign and irresistibly intimate. Foreign because the other can never be assimilated or reduced to sameness. Intimate because identity is, finally, intersubjective. In a sense, there is no self before and apart from its response to the other. To respond to the face, to understand its meaning, Judith Butler explains, means to be awake to what is precarious in another life, or rather, the precariousness of life itself. But this kind of understanding cannot be an an extrapolation from an understanding of my own precariousness to an understanding of another's precarious life. The face of the other, she writes, calls out of narcissism towards something finally more important. Kelly Oliver explains that such Levianism articulations of subjectivity and identity are an emerging corrective to what she believes is still dominant neo-Hegelian tendency to conceptualize relationships as struggles for recognition. Rather than seeing others with the objectifying gaze of self-sufficient subject examining, subordinating, or struggling with the other, we can see each other with loving eyes and invite loving responses. But, she asks, what is love beyond domination? What is love beyond recognition? Levinas writes, communication would be impossible if it should have to begin in the ego, a free subject to whom every other would be only a limitation that invited war, domination, precaution, and information. To communicate is indeed to open oneself, but the openness is not complete if it is not on watch for recognition. The openness is not complete if it is not the watch for recognition. It is complete not in the opening to the spectacle of the recognition of the other, but in becoming a responsibility for him. Levinas is unique in the way he helps us to think theoretically about compassion and our ability to present to one another, whether as listeners or readers. Another approach for those interested in ethical criticism can be found in the archives of the 1990s literary and cultural studies, a moment sometimes referred to as the ethical term. Robert Eaglestone, in a rather sweeping but nonetheless useful and insightful way, summarizes ethical criticism then and now as comprising two camps, those such as Nussbaum, who see literary texts as a form of clarifying moral reasoning that reflect and inform our lives and cultivate our ethical responsibility, and those influenced by deconstruction, such as J. Hillis Miller, who argues that literature offers nothing like a clear moral reasoning, but rather an experience of indecidability that is ethical precisely insofar as it interrupts our relationship with confident ethical knowledge. Dorothy Hale is an example among scholars who are currently working to integrate such theoretical work into the language and rhetoric of human rights. She takes the arguments in the preceding section about the cruelty of the character-driven literature and turns them on their heads. Yes, she concedes in fundamental ways to experience of a novel is the experience of violation. This is because we encounter characters in novels in much the same way as we encounter other minds. They are so real to us that, on some level, we feel they have autonomy. They have the right to human rights, but instead they are trapped by the author, by the plot, by our perceptions as readers, by aesthetic form itself. She writes that all too visible incarceration of subjectivity by aesthetic form is decried as an abuse of representational power. The author who must more or less use a character for his or her expressive ends is felt to be the exploitative. The reader who identifies with a character worries about emotional colonization, and the reader and author who feel only the aesthetic thrill of the character's fate carry the guilt of the voyeur. This guilty pleasure, however, is precisely the starting point of a literary ethics. In novels, the argument goes, we encounter characters as simultaneously free persons and constrained aesthetic artifacts. They exceed our ways of knowing, and because this unsettles us, we seek to reduce them to limited things that we can understand. In this way, literature holds up a mirror to our own being and the world. That's very interesting how they're explaining this through literature. It makes sense. Like, it doesn't make sense, but then when you get down to the end of it, it does make sense. How we treat people and how we experience living human beings kind of mirrors the way that we view characters in the book. So it's interesting that they would write human rights law based on how we would treat a character in the book. That's interesting. Where do we hold up? Literature holds up a mirror to our own beings in the world, allowing us to see, or rather to experience, the way of all human possibility. It is produced in and through the operation of social constraint. The encounter with the literary other is ethical knowledge because it helps us see ourselves as the other, to see how we, too, come into being through mutual vulnerability and constraint, to feel rather than simply know the debts we owe to one another. It is ethical knowledge because of what it starts, because it surprises and often confounds us, unsettles the certainties that we cling to and limit us, opens us to difference and ultimately to the demands of what remains beyond us. Sometimes I think that all the paradoxes of representation described in this book, all the ways it is impossible to get it right for others, are starting points in just this way. The previous section brought me to the end of what I have to say about storytelling and ethics, the end of a long walkway I mentioned earlier. Now I want to say a word about the direction of the scholarly writing today. Mostly scholars are comfortable not mattering. In fact, many would defend not mattering as a precious cultural resource. There should be, they argue, some space for the free play of creative thought, for mediations on the median of our world that are not restricted to the short-term concerns of our historical moment or crippled by instrumental thinking. Studying poverty at a public university is as well and good, but how many jobs will it create for our state economy? Defending irrelevance in the face of such attitudes echoes the call of the spiritual. Poetry, literary critic Paul Fry writes, is the release from significance, the disclosure of freedom through the underdetermination of meaning. Poetry and the criticism that amplifies our experience of poetry satisfies our deep need to experience being rather than doing. So when Fry urges fellow scholars away from historically engaged criticism towards conceptions of the aesthetic that suspend our purposeful engagement with the world, he is calling for a disengagement which is finally ethical. This sort of argument comes in many forms, making a case for the primary of our physiological responses to aesthetic phenomenon. Literary theorist Hans Ulrich Gumbrecht calls for us to rediscover in our research and teaching the moments of intensity that art brings. Moments valuable precisely because there is nothing edifying in them, no message, nothing that we could really learn from them. As Adorno writes, those who fret over relevance are simply unable to listen patiently to a text whose language challenges signification and by its very distance from meaning revolts in advance against positivist subordination of meaning. Relevance, in other words, manifests itself in many ways. What many call irrelevance is often the horizon of understanding. Hi, Adele Louise. Even among those scholars who see value in resisting relevance, however, a great many have found themselves since 2001 yearning for engagement. Those seek a way to reconcile their scholastic pursuits and their moral identities to relieve the felt pressure of internal contradiction. The year 2001 is often identified as a moment of radical sweeping change for world politics and U.S. culture. I generally find such characterizations unpersuasive. However, there are some claims about shifts in U.S. ethical self-conception since 2001 that seem to me undeniable and fundamental. As many have noted, even the vocabulary of the country has changed, bringing into common use unfamiliar words and phrases: ghost prisoner, black site, stress position, waterboarding, and bringing unfamiliar meanings to old words: preemption, rendition. There is, of course, no such thing as a pre-torture U.S. past. Still, it is almost impossible to exaggerate the significance of the United States' official and public articulation of torture policy. Even in the Civil War, when the territorial integrity of the United States was in jeopardy, the U.S. government and military officially repudiated torture. In 1863, General Orders Number 100, better known as the Lieber Code, affirmed the more than 300-year ban on torture in Anglo-American jurisprudence, declaring military necessity does not admit of cruelty, that is, the infliction of suffering for the sake of suffering or for revenge, nor of maiming or wounding except in fight, nor of torture to extort confessions. Post-rendition, post-preemption scholars across the humanities in the United States have begun asking, with an intensity not seen since the Vietnam War, what is the point of what I'm doing? How does the knowledge I'm creating or disseminating relate to what's happening in the real world? Many have come to realize that at this particular moment, the most pressing questions they must take up involve the United States' relationship in the contemporary human rights movement. In my own discipline, literary and cultural studies, we have seen the beginning of the new subfield. A recent clustering of scholarly work focusing on literature and human rights includes Joseph Slaughter's Human Rights, Inc., Elizabeth Anker's Fictions of Dignity Embodying Human Rights in the World Literature, Wendy Hesford's Spectacular Rhetorics, Human Rights Visions, Recognitions, and Feminism, Donna Stanton's special issue of PMLA on Human Rights, Kay Schofer and Sydney Smith, Human Rights and Narrated Lives, Tom F. Keenan's work on media and human rights, Sophia McLennan's work to bridge a disconnect between the humanities and human rights activism, my own, That the World May Know, Elizabeth Swanson Goldberg, Beyond Terror, Gender Narrative, Human Rights, and a subfield defining monogram, from Goldberg and Alexandra Schultes more theoretical perspectives on human rights in literature. This is to say nothing of the many dissertations and forthcoming book manuscripts I've read by young literary scholars working in human rights, or the increasingly wide use in the literary studies as rights-oriented work from related disciplines, including Lynn Hunt's Inventing Human Rights, Elaine Scarry's The Body and Pain, and Giorgio Agamben's State of Exception, or the conferences and faculty seminars in the past several years on human rights and the humanities, or the accelerated creation of human rights minors and liberal arts programs around the country, including my very own Macalester College. These academic trends represent change in a different kind from that of the Vietnam War era, the last time U.S. scholars felt the pressure of history so intensely. For young scholars, then, the aestheticism of the new criticism seemed increasingly disconnected from the values and aspirations of time. Catherine Gallagher and Stephen Greenblatt's characterization of the mid-1970s discovery of anthropological criticism reveals how irrelevant formalist training had made them feel. Our own professional skills to us are more important, more vital and illuminating than we had ourselves grasped. It helped us to renew in us a sense of their value. The new literary historians were those who desired connection to the lives real men and women actually live, to the everyday place where things are actually done, or as Gallagher and Greenblatt write with characteristic grace. We wanted to touch the real in the way that in the earlier period people wanted to touch of the transcendent. Scholars today are developing a new kind of effect towards the real. Their projects might best be understood as therapeutic rather than anthropologic. They seek less to touch the real than to recover from it. But if we are indeed experiencing a new therapeutic turn, it is a strangely impersonal one deeply uncomfortable with the place itself. Global war puts scholars under obligation, first, to better understand our roles as public moral actors, even as this project of self-understanding seems narcissistically inappropriate at the scale at the same time, and second, to better understand the harm to others that we are implicated in, even as the undertaking is experienced as voyeuristic, a pornography of abjection. Or, worse, even as it is experienced as a gift of generous attention, not unlike the gift of humanitarianism itself, which is certainly an act of care, but also an act of power, a performance of privilege that reinscribes hierarchy. Powerful, 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 powerful sentence, which is not unlike the gift of humanitarianism itself, which is certainly an act of care, but also an act of power, a performance of privilege that reinscribes hierarchy. Though we laud charity as a Christian virtue, Mary Douglas writes, we know how much it wounds. The critical study of human rights is an expression, or rather the working of such ethical impasses. In other words, human rights work allows therapeutic displacement. It allows one to experience self-preoccupation as an aspect of purportedly universalizing institutional structure. It allows one to perform one's private anxieties and needs as an aspect of orientation to others. More generously, one might say human rights work offers a secular substitute to the experience of redemption, namely to be personally met by which impersonally exceeds the self. Less generously, one might say that these splits between interior desire and public function are symptoms of, or parallels to, the perfidious contradictions of human rights and international politics. For instance, nations pursue essentially private interests through the rhetorical and institutional frame of the public good of human rights. Human rights are therefore an effective tool for mobilizing populations to disregard human rights, most notably in so-called wars of liberation, or the human rights regime functions to absorb the externalities of, and therefore to act in concert with, the systems it acts against. As the argument goes, human rights work mitigates and therefore sustains the injustices of global neoliberalism, just as it mitigates and therefore sustains the injustices of particular detention systems. The various births of human rights are understood less as emancipations from any given order than as redefinements of them. From Arndt to Zizek, scholars have argued that the idea of universal human rights have always depended upon and even produced a series of cruel and devastating exclusions. When we imagine the man and the rights of man, or today, the human in human rights, we are always imagining a particular kind of human, a normal. Depending on the historical epoch, our definitions have excluded slaves or women or the stateless. It has therefore been, we have 2 more pages left. It has therefore been argued that the universal rights regime is a regulatory regime not unlike, or rather shares the same, I can't say this word, epistemological grounds as a globally ambitious militarized state sovereignty. That is, the idea of rights is tied into the state's threatening capacity to define the very nature of the human. At the same time, however, it is conceded that human rights remain something we cannot want, to borrow a phrase from Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak, and that often the most cynical invocations of rights open space for reappropriation and possibilities of genuine emancipation. As one scholar writes, the projection of the normative egalitarian imaginary not only sets the terms and limits of universality's constituency and makes it possible non-hegemonic rearticulations of universality's compass. In other words, when a system publicly prescribes what it means to be normal, it is constraining you, but also paradoxically making it possible for you to creatively imagine more inclusive possibilities. It promotes liberation both because it has put before you a disguised command that can be undisguised, or a set of assumptions that can be deconstruction and become even hypocritical or merely gestural uses of egalitarian rhetoric help to publicly legitimize egalitarian principles. The ambivalence of U.S. scholars towards human rights is a mirror image of the U.S. government's ambivalence. For the former, human rights discourse is suspect because it is viewed as an extension of U.S. hegemony. I will never be able to say that word. Hegemony. It is such a small word. Hegemony. I know the word. I can never pronounce it. Hegemony. That's so wrong. That's not how it's pronounced. I promise that's not how it's pronounced. For the latter, because it is viewed as an infringement upon it. The United States helped give birth to United Nations, and through sponsorship of Eleanor Roosevelt, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but it has also refused to ratify a range of crucial human rights treaties, including the Convention of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the Convention on Discrimination Against Women, and the Convention on the Rights of the Child. The vision of the fully realized international human rights movement is both the latest incarnation of American utopian promise and its dystopic nightmare. I have one last story to share. The first soldier I met in Japan was Kubotera-san. Even now, so many years later, my memory of that visit is very clear. As the interviews accumulated over time, details began to wash away. What each person's house was like, what they were wearing, who was there. I can only reconstruct it now by looking back at my notes. But I still see Kubotera-san kneeling on a pillow in the center of that meticulously cleaned, elegantly simple wood plank room. Frail hands folded on his thighs, head slightly bowed, spine effortlessly erect. In some ways, it is not the content of the interview that remains most vivid. He described himself as somebody who killed children, and I had to ask him about that, and I had never done that before. But listening to somebody talk about how they killed a child is an unsettling experience, in part because it doesn't feel unsettling enough. It would take many months before I was able to have coherent emotions about that, and even then, it manifested itself in curious ways. When we sat down together, he gave us small portions of peanuts to eat. He had just harvested them, shelled and dried them, and roasted them for us. Later, I learned that he had redone his paper walls in anticipation of our visit. We chatted awkwardly for a bit at first, looking for harmless topics. I learned that he was the oldest of 11 children raised on a farm, that he had no memories of studying or playing, because when he wasn't working in the field, he needed to care for his siblings. Our conversation was laced with his apologies. We are country folk. We don't know much about things in the city, and we're old besides, so all we do now is give you a country-style reception. And while my brain is a little old, and I tend to get Showa dates and AD dates mixed up, the way he held himself, Kubotera-san seemed resigned to being less, and he seemed also like he was prepared to receive something that, if tracked to its source, might have shadowed hope. It felt so wrong that I was the person talking to him, a literature professor from a small college in the Midwest, for God's sake. But we talked for a long time. It was our longest single interview, in fact. We didn't understand, because it was the first one, what that would do to a person like him. We had so many questions we wanted to ask. We just kept asking. I shifted continually on the floor, aches gathering in my knees and shoulders. He remained so still. I didn't even realize he was in pain until he needed help rising at the end. It was hot, so we drank then, thirstily. There was something about the act, that simple release into his own need, that struck me. I realized later what it was. The small acts of self-care that we are incessantly perform, that we don't even think of as self-care, adjusting our balance for comfort, fidgeting to release tension, scratching ourselves or rubbing our face for release or stimulation. He had done none of that. The rain threatened that day, so I brought my umbrella. After a lengthy goodbye, I realized I forgot it and darted back into the entryway to grab it. I forgot to take off my shoes. My interpreter threw herself onto her knees to brush her hands over where I had walked, apologizing. And that, my friends, is the end of Evil Men. My favorite part after finishing a book is I don't have the book jacket on it, but I like to turn over the book and I read the book jacket and then I kind of go like this, look at all the shit that I read. And then I put it on the shelf and I never look at it again. We just read 240 pages of stuff. Hi, Sam. Hegemony. Damn, that's right. Star Series Hegemony. I have to see it spelled out like that. Otherwise, I can't say it. And happy almost birthday, Carl. Hegemony. God, my mouth. I think I'm going to lose my voice. Hegemony. 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 I'm never going to stop saying it now. Hegemony. The Kama Sutra. That was a lot, but we read it. We read a book. It took 9 hours, but we did it. You're welcome, Missy. We read a 9-hour book. Don't we all feel cultured and refined now? So now you can tell people that you've written a book. You've read a book, even though I read it. You can be like, I read this book, and it took a long time, 9 hours, but we read it. God, I'm so tired. I have to unwind now. I have to go make lunch for the kids. So thank you all for listening. Haunted Vagina next. Yeah, if anybody wants to take classes over Zoom for $20 for an hour and a half on how to read and write Japanese hiragana and katakana, which is 2 of the 3 alphabets, just let me know. I'm putting together a lesson plan. Sorry, I'm so hot. I had the door closed because the air conditioning was loud. I need to get out there. Yeah, 9 hours. Adele Louise. So I'm going to go because my large self is melting. And I'll talk to you guys later. I'll probably do just the talking one tomorrow. But I love you guys. You have a good day, okay? Bye.